The last thing Officer Daniel Blake expected when he bought his dream home was to be treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood. But that's exactly what happened when he moved into the pristine, HOA-governed community of Cypress Grove. Started innocently enough, Daniel. A decorated police officer with over 15 years of service had finally saved enough to move his wife, Melissa, and their 2 kids into a quiet, gated neighborhood that promised peace and order. But from day one, they were watched. It's not in a neighborly way, but in a suspicious clipboard and phone camera kind of way. At the center of it all was Gloria Whitman, the HOA president, a woman with a tight bun, sharper tongue, and a superiority complex that made her believe she ran more than just the block. Gloria had her eyes on Daniel before he even finished unloading the moving truck. She walked straight up, arms folded, and without even introducing herself, said, "That mailbox isn't regulation height, officer." Daniel laughed, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. That same night, he found a violation notice taped to his door, along with a welcome packet from the HOA. It listed 58 community rules, many of them subjective and ridiculous, like banning excessively patriotic lawn decor and limiting driveway usage to only 2 hours per day for cleaning. Daniel shrugged it off. As a cop, he was used to dealing with unreasonable people. But what he didn't realize was that Gloria's petty violations were just the start of something much uglier. The next week, Daniel was reprimanded again for having his patrol car parked in his own driveway overnight. Gloria claimed it violated the community's aesthetics. When Daniel explained he was on call and needed quick access to his cruiser, she smiled and replied, "Rules are rules, even for you." This time, Daniel attended the next HOA board meeting, thinking he could reason with the other members. He was shocked to find that they were nothing more than puppets, ratteries, and stay-at-home enforcers, too scared to question Gloria's rule book. She ran the meetings like a courtroom, gavel and all, silencing anyone who opposed her. Daniel calmly voiced his concerns, pointing out that HOA guidelines didn't explicitly ban marked police vehicles. But Gloria simply waved him off, saying she had community support to interpret rules how she saw fit. Days later, Daniel's kids were approached by a neighbor, asking if their dad was allowed to have weapons in the house. That neighbor just happened to be Gloria's close friend Margot, who was also on the HOA's so-called safety subcommittee. Rumors started to spread Daniel was aggressive. Daniel was dangerous. Daniel made people feel unsafe. It didn't take long before he received a letter stating his presence was causing heightened tension, and that the HOA board would be discussing further action. Furious, Daniel filed a formal complaint and requested copies of all HOA meeting minutes. What he discovered was damning. Gloria had been pushing a quiet campaign labeling him a threat to community harmony, and lobbying for new rules targeting law enforcement visibility in the neighborhood. She even filed a false report to the HOA insurance company, claiming Daniel's cruiser created a visual deterrent to homebuyers. Things reached a boiling point one morning when Daniel came home after a night shift and found Melissa crying on the front porch. Gloria had called Child Protective Services, claiming their kids were unsupervised during the day while Daniel slept off his shifts. CPS quickly dismissed the claim, but the damage was done. The very people Daniel vowed to protect were now being used against him. He wasn't just angry, he was done being silent. He returned to the next HOA meeting, not as a polite homeowner, but as a trained investigator. In front of a full room, Daniel began to unravel a series of glorious abuses, misuse of funds, fake violation reports, manipulation of HOA documents, and illegal surveillance of residents via hidden cameras she installed under the guise of safety upgrades. One board member fainted. The others sat in stunned silence as Daniel played audio recordings and displayed photos from the neighborhood's Facebook group where Gloria coordinated her tactics. She tried to interrupt, tried to gavel him down, but the room turned on her. By the time he finished, half the residents were calling for her resignation, and someone had already phoned the HOA's legal office. But Daniel wasn't finished, not by a long shot. What started as neighborhood politics had now become a personal war, and Daniel was going to expose every corrupt corner of Cypress Grove, no matter how deep it ran. Won't believe what he uncovers next. Make sure you don't miss a single. Twist follow Sham stories for the full truth behind HOA madness that pushed a cop to the edge. Daniel knew the war with the HOA was no longer about a parked police cruiser or lawn decorations. It was about power, intimidation, and exposing a system that had bullied not just him, but many others into silence. After his public confrontation, at the HOA meeting, the neighborhood buzzed with gossip, whispers, and nervous glances. Gloria hadn't shown her face since that night, but Daniel was certain she wasn't retreating. She was regrouping. That's when the retaliation began. The very next morning, Daniel woke up to find a letter from the HOA taped no, stapled to his front door. It accused him of unauthorized audio surveillance of board members, citing vague privacy laws, and claiming he had violated the HOA's rights. Daniel, having followed legal protocol with all his recordings only in public meetings and on his property, knew it was a desperate bluff. But the tone had changed. They were trying to paint him not just as a nuisance, but as a lawbreaker. Within 2 days, Daniel received 3 more violation notices, one for excessive noise from a supposed lawnmower that hadn't run in weeks, another for non-native flora after Melissa planted rose bushes in their yard, and one claiming his porch light was too bright and disturbed the ambiance of the street. Melissa, now emotionally worn from the stress, started urging Daniel to sell the house and leave the neighborhood behind. But Daniel wasn't wired that way. He didn't back down, especially not when injustice stared him in the face. Instead, he doubled down. He began interviewing other residents, quietly at first, approaching them during walks or casual grocery store encounters. What he heard was startling. An elderly widow named Ruth confessed that she had been fined hundreds over the years for window glare and unkept flower beds, even though she hired a gardener twice a month. A young couple down the street said their baby monitor had picked up strange static patterns that later turned out to be audio frequencies from Gloria's safety cameras. Others described being shamed in HOA newsletters or during meetings, pushed to conform or leave. Daniel compiled everything: testimonies, photos, violation letters, and timelines into a thick, organized binder labeled HOA Misconduct Cypress Grove. He wasn't just preparing for another HOA meeting, he was preparing for court. But Gloria still had influence, and she wasn't done. She submitted a formal complaint to the local precinct, accusing Daniel of abusing his authority and harassing civilians while off duty. His captain, who knew Daniel's integrity, dismissed it quickly. It still triggered an internal review that left Daniel humiliated in front of his peers. Worse, Gloria now used this as fuel, telling neighbors that even the police department was investigating him. The smear campaign had escalated. Flyers began to appear on doors, anonymous, but clearly written in Gloria's style, warning that Daniel's presence increased community risk. It became clear to him that Gloria was trying to bait him into reacting. She wanted him to lash out, make a mistake, so she could finish him off both in the neighborhood and as an officer. But Daniel remained calm. Instead of responding with anger, he used his skills as a detective. He filed FOIA requests for HOA records, including financial reports, maintenance contracts, and meeting minutes. What came back was a goldmine. Over $120,000 had been spent in the last 3 years on aesthetic enhancements and surveillance upgrades, most of which were contracted to a company owned by Gloria's nephew. Worse, some of the checks were signed during meetings that had no quorum illegally authorized. Daniel documented it all, then turned to a local journalist he trusted, a woman named Erin, who had once covered corruption in city housing boards. She agreed to investigate, warning that it might take time, but that stories like this needed to be told. As Erin began reaching out to HOA members, things got hotter. Gloria finally broke her silence. She called an emergency HOA meeting, claiming Daniel had endangered the community, and introduced a vote to suspend his homeowner privileges, including access to the community center and common areas. The meeting was packed. Gloria came dressed like she was hosting a courtroom drama, complete with printed handouts, alleged screenshots of Daniel's behavior, and a PowerPoint presentation. But Daniel was ready. When it was his turn to speak, he calmly presented his binder to the room, flipping through pages that exposed financial fraud, targeted harassment, and falsified rule interpretations. People gasped when he revealed that Gloria's nephew's company didn't even have a proper business license. Several residents who had been silent for years suddenly raised their voices. Ruth stood and shared her story with tears in her eyes. The young couple revealed their baby monitor interference. Aaron, the journalist, stood in the back taking notes and snapping photos. By the end of the meeting, the mood had turned against Gloria entirely. Still, she refused to step down, claiming she was elected fairly and had every right to interpret community policy. But the board had seen enough. One member called for an emergency vote of no confidence. Another seconded, and within 10 minutes, the board voted 5-1 to suspend Gloria pending a full review. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her, yelling about lawsuits and conspiracies. Daniel didn't celebrate. He knew better than to assume this was over. He returned home that night to find his tires slashed and a dead squirrel nailed to his porch with a note that read, "Snitches lose everything." Melissa was terrified, the kids shaken. But Daniel, though furious, kept it quiet. He installed motion-sensitive cameras around the entire property, increased patrols near his home, and began quietly working with an attorney on a civil suit. The next step wasn't just neighborhood justice, it was full legal accountability. He now had allies, residents who had once been too scared to speak, board members who finally saw the rot within their leadership, and a journalist eager to expose the truth. But he also had enemies lurking in the shadows, desperate, bitter, and willing to do anything to protect their power. And Gloria wasn't gone yet. Wait, not by a long shot. The war for Cypress Grove was only getting started. Daniel barely slept the night after Gloria was suspended, not because he feared for himself, but because he now knew what people like her were capable of when cornered. The squirrel incident wasn't just petty, it was psychological warfare. A warning, a promise that the fight wasn't over. But Daniel had dealt with worse in his line of duty. He'd stood face to face with violent criminals, traffickers, and armed maniacs. Gloria's brand of suburban tyranny was venomous, but lacked real bite if faced properly. Still, what unnerved him more than anything was how many people had silently allowed this culture of fear to spread under her rule. It was the system of intimidation and silence that had taken root over the years. Why he pressed forward, working with Aaron the journalist and his attorney to bring every piece of truth into the light. Aaron began drafting a full feature for her newspaper's weekend issue, and her research dug even deeper into the HOA's mismanagement. She uncovered that Gloria had been issuing informal fines money collected directly and not recorded in the HOA ledger. One resident had paid over $1,500 over the course of 2 years for parking violations that were never processed through official channels. That money had gone into a personal account tied to Gloria's cousin. Aaron's article would be explosive. Meanwhile, Daniel's attorney filed a preliminary notice of intent to sue the HOA for harassment, defamation, and retaliatory actions against a public servant. The letter caused panic in the boardroom, prompting several of the remaining members to request an emergency legal review. By the end of that week, Daniel received a phone call from a shaken board member named Leslie, who admitted she'd been pressured for years into approving Gloria's suggestions out of fear of being voted out or exposed. Leslie offered to provide documentation to support Daniel's claims in exchange for confidentiality. Daniel accepted, and what she handed over was shocking. It included email chains where Gloria openly discussed fabricating violations against homeowners she found uncooperative, and messages mocking Ruth's age and mental health. In one, Gloria bragged about how easy it was to break in the new cop. Daniel didn't realize how deep the manipulation ran until he read those words. But as the pressure mounted, Gloria finally made her next move, and it was louder than anyone anticipated. Late one night, the silence of Cypress Grove was shattered by flashing blue lights. Daniel opened his front door to find 2 squad cars and a city code enforcement officer standing at the edge of his lawn. Gloria had filed a formal complaint accusing him of housing illegally stored weapons, claiming he had an unsecured arsenal that posed a danger to nearby children. The officer, reluctantly doing his duty, asked to see Daniel's license and permits. Daniel, calm but simmering inside, opened his gun safe in front of the body cam, showed every single registered firearm, each secured according to regulation. The officer apologized before leaving, whispering, "She's out of control." The next day, Daniel filed a police report against Gloria for filing a false report and making malicious use of emergency services. He forwarded it to his department and to the city's HOA Regulatory Commission. The dominoes began to fall. Aaron's article published the following morning. It was titled, "Queen of the Cul-de-sac: How an HOA President Terrorized a Community." Within hours, the story went viral. News vans parked outside the community gates. Neighbors who had previously ignored Daniel now crossed the street to shake his hand, offering hushed thanks or tearful confessions of how they too had suffered under Gloria's rule. Even the city council issued a statement calling for increased regulation of private HOA boards. But just as Daniel thought the worst was behind him, a fire alarm shattered the peace. At 3:14 a.m., his home security system triggered an alert. Smoke was pouring from his backyard shed. Daniel rushed out with a fire extinguisher, and by the time the fire department arrived, most of the flames were out. But the damage had been done. The cause? Arson confirmed by the fire chief. Surveillance footage showed a masked figure tossing accelerant over the shed and lighting it with a matchstick. The footage wasn't crystal clear, but the build and posture were all too familiar. Daniel knew it had to be Gloria, or one of her remaining loyalists. He handed over the footage, but no immediate arrest followed. The investigation would take time. Meanwhile, Daniel's lawsuit gained traction. More homeowners joined, forming a class action claim against the HOA for harassment, financial fraud, and emotional distress. Daniel's attorney pushed forward aggressively, requesting quartered audits of all HOA financial activity over the last 5 years. By now, Gloria had gone underground. She removed herself from the HOA directory, shut down her personal Facebook account, and was seen only once in public, quickly leaving in a tinted SUV. But her legacy of control hadn't entirely vanished. A small faction of HOA loyalists, some of whom benefited from her favoritism, began sowing distrust, spreading flyers suggesting Daniel wanted to defund the HOA entirely, to let riffraff in, to destroy the neighborhood's property values. One flyer even photoshopped his face onto a mugshot and placed it on mailboxes with the words, "Would you trust this man with your kids?" Daniel knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who'd ever been silenced by those in power misusing a system meant to protect community standards. So he pushed back harder, held a public town hall meeting outside the HOA's community, center notarized but perfectly. Legal and over 40 residents attended. He laid out the truth, presented financial records, violation statistics, patterns of targeting, and even shared anonymous testimonies from scared neighbors. For the first time, people began speaking freely. Ruth, now emboldened, offered to testify in court. The young couple contributed screenshots of the baby monitor interference. Leslie, the former board member, agreed to give a deposition. It wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about reform. Daniel proposed a new slate of board members, including himself, to oversee temporary reforms and open the books. The crowd applauded. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following week, and Daniel knew it would be the most important one yet, but he also knew it could be dangerous. Gloria had disappeared, but not without leaving behind a handful of diehard enforcers, and based on the patterns he'd studied, she wouldn't go down without making one last move, one that could put everything, even lives, at risk. Daniel told Melissa to take the kids to her parents for the weekend. He reinforced their home security and began preparing for whatever was coming. He didn't know exactly what it would be, but every instinct in him as a cop told him this storm was far from over, and the final confrontation was going to shake Cypress Grove to its core. The night before the HOA's emergency re-election meeting, Cypress Grove was quieter than usual, but Daniel could feel the pressure in the air like a storm about to break. The neighborhood that once buzzed with children's laughter and lawnmowers now felt suspended in uneasy silence. He had spent the entire day preparing, checking, and double-checking every piece of evidence, ensuring his binder of documents, digital backups, video clips, and written statements were all organized and ready. But what weighed heavier than anything was the fear that Gloria, or someone still loyal to her, would try to sabotage the meeting or worse. Daniel hadn't forgotten the arson, and neither had the fire marshal, who still hadn't officially named a suspect but heavily implied that someone with a personal vendetta was likely responsible. Melissa had left with the kids that morning, heading 3 hours north to her parents' home in a quiet rural town. Daniel insisted they'd go not because he was afraid for himself, but because Gloria had already shown she was willing to hurt more than reputations. As night fell, Daniel stood on his porch, flashlight in hand, watching as a few cars passed slowly down the street, some slowing near his house before moving on. He didn't sleep much. By morning, he had made coffee strong enough to keep him alert through whatever was coming. At precisely 9 a.m., the HOA meeting began inside the community center. It was the largest turnout in the HOA's history. More than 70 homeowners had shown up, some curious, some nervous, and a few openly hostile. The usual board table was set up at the front, but this time it felt more like a courtroom. Gloria, to everyone's shock, arrived 5 minutes late. She walked in, dressed in black slacks and a charcoal blazer, sunglasses hiding her eyes, and her trademark clipboard tucked under one arm like a shield. Her appearance sent a wave of murmurs through the room. For a woman who had disappeared in disgrace, she didn't look broken. She looked ready to fight. She took a seat at the end of the table, without saying a word, flanked by two of her most loyal allies, both former board members who had stepped down earlier that year. The current interim president, a retired teacher named Harold Whitmore, called the meeting to order and laid out the agenda. 3 items. First, a vote on the permanent removal of Gloria Whitman from all HOA functions. Second, the presentation of Daniel Blake's investigation. And third, a public vote for new board members, including the open presidential seat. Daniel was asked to present first, stood before the residents, cleared his throat, and began walking them through everything. He showed the pattern of selective fines, the conflicts of interest in vendor contracts, and the direct evidence of harassment, including Gloria's written plans to target specific homeowners. He played clips from board meetings, highlighted discrepancies in the budget reports, and read aloud a particularly disturbing email in which Gloria suggested that allowing visible law enforcement vehicles in the neighborhood would attract low-income curiosity and lower property values. The gasps in the room were real. He ended by sharing the arson report and the threats made against his family. Gloria, to everyone's amazement, did not object during his entire presentation. She sat completely still, jaw locked, as if waiting for her turn. When it came, she rose calmly, removed her sunglasses, and began her defense. "Let me be clear," she said, voice icy but controlled. "What I did was in the interest of protecting this community's standards. I never acted alone. These decisions were made with full board approval." She tried to dismiss Daniel's findings as misinterpreted or taken out of context. When someone from the crowd shouted, "What about the cash fines?" she ignored it. Then she shifted the narrative, attempting to cast Daniel as a man with a vendetta, a dangerous man with unfettered access to surveillance equipment and influence within local law enforcement. She accused him of manipulating the community into fear, twisting the truth to grab power. It was a masterclass in deflection and projection, but the residents weren't buying it this time. Ada Ruth stood up first, her voice trembling but strong. "You used me. You mocked me behind my back. I trusted you, Gloria, and you turned this place into your kingdom." More people followed one after another. They shared their stories, validating everything Daniel had exposed. Then came the vote. Ballots were distributed and residents lined up to drop their decisions in the box. 20 minutes later, Harold returned to the front and announced the result, by a count of 64-8. Gloria Whitman was officially and permanently removed from the Cypress Grove HOA board. The room erupted not in cheers, but in a collective sigh of relief. Gloria stood, scoffed, and without another word, stormed out. But as Daniel watched her leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. After a short break, the board opened the floor for nominations. Daniel was nominated for president, along with 2 others. The final vote took place in full transparency, and by an overwhelming margin, Daniel was elected as the new president of the HOA. It felt surreal. From public enemy to community leader, all within a few months. But Daniel didn't let the title go to his head. He knew the real work had just begun. Over the next few weeks, Daniel launched a full internal audit, restructured how violations were issued, created a public forum where residents could anonymously report board misconduct. The HOA newsletter changed tone from rules and threats to updates and community events. Yard signs began to vanish. Smiles returned. But beneath the surface, something still stirred. One morning, Daniel found an envelope slid under his office door at the community center. It was unmarked and contained only a single photo, his family standing outside their car, unaware they were being watched. The message was clear. Someone was still out there. He took the photo straight to the local police department. The investigation reopened. The arsonist had never been caught, and now this photograph proved the threat was ongoing. Daniel installed more cameras, not just around his house, but around the community center and key public areas. His leadership role, once a burden, now became a mission. He wasn't just cleaning up after Gloria, he was fighting a deeper culture of secrecy, fear, and entitlement. Then came the news that turned everything upside down. Erin, the journalist, called him one afternoon, sounding breathless. Her research had uncovered that the company Gloria used to funnel funds, the one owned by her nephew, was actually a shell corporation connected to multiple HOA embezzlement cases across 3 counties. It appeared that Gloria hadn't just been an overzealous neighborhood tyrant, she was part of a much larger scam targeting upscale HOA communities for easy money through fake violations and contractor kickbacks. Daniel realized then that this wasn't just about Cypress Grove anymore. He forwarded the information to the state attorney general's office. Investigators launched a statewide probe, and Daniel was asked to provide a formal statement. Story had become the catalyst for something much bigger. Still, with every win came more pressure. One evening, while reviewing security footage, Daniel caught a glimpse of a figure moving through the trees near his backyard, again masked, again watching. The image froze on the screen, haunting and real. Called it in, but the patrol car that responded found nothing. Whoever it was, they were careful. Professional, maybe? Couldn't be sure if it was Gloria, her allies, or someone from the wider scheme. But the feeling of being hunted never fully left. Despite the stress, he pressed forward, organizing a community safety team, holding monthly meetings with law enforcement and implementing a neighborhood emergency alert system. For the first time, the people of Cypress Grove felt involved, informed, and safe. But just when it seemed like peace had returned, Daniel received a phone call from Melissa that chilled his blood. She had seen Gloria near her parents' home, sitting in a car parked across the street, just watching. They called the local authorities, who took a report, but by the time they arrived, the car was gone. This wasn't over, not yet. The moment Melissa called Daniel with news of seeing Gloria near her parents' house, every alarm in his mind went off like a fire drill. This wasn't just coincidence, and it wasn't desperation, it's escalation. Gloria had gone silent. In Cypress Grove, vanished from HOA meetings and online spaces, but now it was clear she had simply changed her methods. She wasn't trying to win anymore. She was trying to unnerve, to intimidate, and possibly to retaliate. The car she'd been seen in was a gray sedan with no front license plate, and it matched the vehicle Daniel had spotted near their home, just days after the arson incident. The connection was undeniable. Daniel contacted the local sheriff's department in Melissa's hometown, and they began a quiet surveillance effort near her parents' property, placing motion cameras and patrols nearby. Meanwhile, Daniel returned to Cypress Grove, more determined than ever. He didn't tell the residents what Melissa had seen. He didn't want to cause panic, but he did implement a temporary community curfew, citing unidentified surveillance. Threats. The residents trusted him now, and most of them complied without question. But behind the scenes, Daniel was working with a private investigator, former colleague from the department who specialized in tracking individuals trying to avoid detection. Together, they began reconstructing Gloria's digital footprint. What they found was shocking. Gloria had been traveling across county lines, tending off the record HOA gatherings with other controversial board members from different neighborhoods. These weren't casual meetings. They were strategic sessions where figures like Gloria traded tactics for suppressing homeowners, dodging audits, maximizing HOA power under the radar of local governments. The scheme extended into a regional network of fraudulent contractor relationships, dummy fines, and forged code citations. One name popped up more than once: Marvin Ross. The man listed as CEO of the shell company Gloria had funneled HOA funds. He turned out to be a middleman in over a dozen HOA scams in the state, using fake LLCs to bill communities for repairs or installations that either didn't happen or were grossly overpriced. Daniel now had a case not just of personal harassment, but of organized fraud spanning multiple jurisdictions. He contacted the state attorney general's office again, and this time they responded with urgency. A task force was assembled, and Daniel became their chief witness. Back in Cypress Grove, Daniel prepared for what he hoped would be a final confrontation. He had received legal authorization to freeze HOA accounts pending the fraud investigation, and he scheduled a special community meeting for a public disclosure of everything Gloria's full network, the extent of the embezzlement, and the next steps. But 2 nights before the meeting, as Daniel left the community center to walk to his car, a figure emerged from the shadows. A woman's small frame, dark jacket, and face partially hidden stepped toward him, and before he could reach his weapon, she tossed an envelope onto the pavement and disappeared down the side street. By the time he rounded the corner, she was gone. Inside the envelope was a single USB drive and a note. "You think you've won, but you don't know who you're really dealing with." Daniel returned home and loaded the drive onto a secure laptop. What played was a series of internal video recordings from Gloria's own meetings, private gatherings where she boasted about fixing the system, laughing at homeowners, mocking the elderly, and bragging about how even cops couldn't stop her. In one clip, she said plainly, "They can't fire me. Built this place like a castle, and I'm the queen." But the last video chilled Daniel to his core. Dotted showed Gloria standing in front of a wall map covered in red pins pointing to HOA communities across the state. "Each of these," she said, "has someone loyal. And if Blake thinks he can stop all of us, he's got another thing coming."
Always.
It was bigger than fraud. It was a network of HOA extremists who saw themselves as rulers, not caretakers. Daniel handed the footage to the task force, and the state initiated a mass investigation into the involved communities. Arrests followed. Marvin Ross was detained in a sting operation involving wire fraud. 3 other HOA presidents were charged with conspiracy. Gloria, however, remained elusive. A warrant was issued for her arrest, but she had vanished entirely. Weeks passed, then months. Daniel tried to move forward. He rebuilt the HOA with a new board, established community-led policy, voting, returned funds to residents who had been scammed, and even launched a nonprofit aimed at HOA reform statewide. Melissa and the kids returned home. Peace returned slowly but steadily. And yet one evening in early spring, Daniel checked his mailbox and found a single sheet of paper inside. No envelope. Just a note written in tight, slanted handwriting. "We're still watching." He scanned it for prints. None. He forwarded it to the authorities. No DNA match. But Daniel didn't flinch. He doubled security, expanded the HOA's external partnerships with law enforcement, and made a vow he would keep for the rest of his life. Never again would an HOA become a weapon in the hands of power-hungry tyrants like Gloria. Cypress Grove had become the example for reform, and Daniel had become a quiet hero to countless homeowners across the region who now stood up, shared their stories, and took back their communities. But Gloria's shadow lingered, and Daniel knew she was out there watching, waiting, and likely planning. Still, he stood firm, because now he had the neighborhood, the state, and the law on his side. And he had turned a quiet HOA street into the front line of a movement no one could silence. If you want more jaw-dropping stories like this, real drama where justice faces power and wins, then don't miss out. Subscribe now to Sham Stories. For more unbelievable HOA twists, confrontations, and justice served cold. You won't believe what's coming next. Asterisk.